a story which, in the Brothers Grimm edition, is called The Two Kings' Children, but might be better called The Prince and the Princess. There was, long ago, a king who had a son who, when he was born, the king had his horoscope cast by an astrologer, and the astrologer said, "The stars are saying that when your son becomes 16, he will be killed by a stag in the forest." Perhaps knowing that fate is everything, that destiny cannot be avoided, the king did not try to stop his son when he went hunting in the forest just after his 16th birthday. And the prince followed a stag, a great stag with big, huge antlers, and he followed the stag further and further into the forest until he reached the darkest part of the forest, and there it was that the stag disappeared, and in his place stood a tall man. And the tall man led the prince over the border to the next country and took him to the castle of the king who ruled that land. And the prince sat at table with the king and his wife and the king's 3 daughters. And the king said to the prince, "I will set you a task for each of the next 3 nights. Tonight you are to watch over my oldest daughter, and every hour I will come to her room and I will ask you a question." So the prince was led to the bedchamber of the oldest daughter, and she showed him the statue of St. Christopher that stood in her bedroom. And she said to the statue of St. Christopher, "When my father comes, you must answer the questions." And the statue of St. Christopher nodded. The prince lay down on the floor just inside the doorway and slept soundly all night. And the next morning when he awoke, the king said to him, "You have done well. Tonight you will watch over my second daughter." So the prince was taken to the bedchamber of the second princess. And she too had a statue of St. Christopher in her room, and she said to the statue of St. Christopher, "When my father comes, you must answer the questions." And the statue nodded. And in the morning, the king said to the prince, "You have done well." So on the 3rd night, he was taken to the bedchamber of the youngest princess. And she said to her statue of St. Christopher, "When my father comes, you must answer the questions." So on the next morning, the king said, "I have a task for you today." And he took the prince to a forest and said, "Every tree must be cut down by sunset tonight." And although the prince began to cut down the trees, he hadn't cut down many trees. By the time the sun had reached the top of the sky, and it was then that the princess brought him some food. And after he had eaten, what with a full belly and what with the heat of the day, the prince fell asleep. And it was then that the princess called to her friends, and the gnomes appeared. Gnomes, little men, appeared. And the gnomes fetched their families, and together all the gnomes cut down all the trees in the forest. They hadn't invented environmental protesters at this time, and stacked the wood neatly. So by the evening, the prince was congratulated by the king for his great labour. And the next day, the king took the prince to a lake and said, "This is my lake. By sunset, you will have emptied the lake, filled it with crystal clear water, and stocked it with fish." And when the sun had reached the top of the sky, the youngest princess appeared, and the prince ate the food that she brought for him. And with a full belly, and with the heat of the sun, the prince fell asleep. And it was then that the princess called for her friends, the gnomes. And the gnomes emptied the lake, filled it with clear water, and filled it with fish. On the third morning, the king took the prince to a hill and said, "This hill is covered with thorn bushes. By sunset tonight, you will have cut down all the thorn bushes." When the sun had reached the top of the sky, the princess appeared, and the prince ate the food that she brought. And then he fell asleep, and the princess called for her gnomes and their families, and they cut down all the thorn bushes. And it was then that the king, realizing his daughter was in love with the young prince, gave them permission to marry. But he also said, "You cannot marry until your older two sisters have also married." But to young people, years seem like a long time, so they decided to run away. And the next day, the two of them ran away, and they had gone some distance when they turned, and they could see the princess's father, the king, following them. The princess said, "I will turn myself into a rose, and I will turn you into a rose bush." So she turned herself into a rose and hid among the thorns of the rose bush. And when the king saw the rose bush and looked around and couldn't see his daughter or the prince, he simply turned and returned to the castle and his wife. And his wife said, "The rose was our daughter, and the rose bush was the prince. If you had cut the rose, the bush would have followed." The next day the king set out, following the two young lovers. And they saw him. And when they saw him, the princess turned her prince into a church, and she turned herself into a preacher. And when the king reached the church, he realized he could no longer see his daughter. He could no longer see the prince. And so he returned home to his wife in the castle and explained what had happened. And she said, "If you had brought out the preacher, the church would have followed." So on the third morning, the king's wife set out on her own, and the prince and the princess saw the queen following them. And the princess turned the prince into a pond, and herself into a fish. And the fish swam around in the water of the pond. But when the queen arrived at the pond and tried to catch the fish, she couldn't. And it was then that she realised the prince and the princess were destined for each other. So, before she gave them farewell, the queen gave her daughter 3 walnuts and said, "If you need my help, open each walnut in turn." So the prince and the princess carried on their journey until they reached the kingdom of the prince. But sadly, the princess waited outside the castle while the prince went inside to speak to his father, the king. And as he crossed the doorway into the castle, his memory of everything that had happened simply vanished. He forgot about his true love. He forgot about the stag. He forgot about the tasks he had been set. And he simply went back to his old life. The princess decided to wait for him, knowing that one day his memory would return. So she worked as a maid for the local miller, and she spent her afternoons down by the river washing pots. The king arranged for his son to marry the princess from another land, and the date for the wedding was arranged. And on the morning of the wedding day, the princess said to the miller, "May I go watch the wedding?" And she took one of the walnuts that her mother had given her and cracked it open. And inside the walnut was the most beautiful dress that you ever saw. So the princess put on the beautiful dress and went to the church and stood by the altar. And when the prince and his bride arrived, the bride looked at the princess and her beautiful dress and said, "I will not marry you until you have provided me with a dress at least as beautiful as hers." So the next day, the wedding was due to take place, and the princess stole away from the miller. She took the second walnut and cracked it open, and inside was a dress even more beautiful than the first. And when the bride saw the princess standing there in the beautiful dress, realizing that it outshone her own wedding gown, she said, "I will not marry you until you have provided me with a dress at least as beautiful as that one." On the third morning, the princess had opened her third and last walnut, which contained the most beautiful dress that has ever been seen. And when the prince arrived at the church, expecting to marry his arranged bride, he recognized his true love. He recognized the princess, and all the memories came flooding back. And so the two young lovers were reunited. The prince and the princess were married to each other that day. And of course, the two of them lived. This is your line. Come on, you do this bit for me. Come on, or with me. They lived happily ever after. The only thing the story doesn't tell us is what happened to the three dresses. There we are. The path of true love never does run smooth, but we always get there in the end, don't we? I rather like that. The story of two young lovers running away and the story of an arranged marriage being thwarted. Yeah. But it is very, very sad about all the trees being cut down. So if you'd like to do something to help reforest the earth, I'm going to put a link to Ecosia down below. Yeah. Lovely. So, may you find a dress as beautiful as the princesses, but I'm sure if you're wearing it, it really will be. Please do subscribe. Please do visit the Brothers Grimm Facebook group, and I hope to see you again soon. Tell stories.